What if the most dangerous weapon in the Middle East wasn't a missile, a jet, or a bomb, but a narrow strip of water that the entire world depended on? And what if a country that had built its entire strategy around this strait suddenly discovered that it was no longer truly in its hands? That is exactly what just happened in the Strait of Hormuz. And the story of how it happened reveals more about modern warfare than any single battle ever could. Before we dive into what actually unfolded, hit that subscribe button right now. We break down these high-stakes military and geopolitical stories with the clarity and depth you simply will not find anywhere else. Every week, we connect the dots that mainstream coverage misses. Join this community of informed viewers and never get caught off guard by the next major development. And if this breakdown helps you understand what is really going on, tap that like button. It tells us to keep digging into stories like this one. The Strait of Hormuz looks small on the map. That is why it deceives people. A place can look small, but its economy can still be in its hands. This passage lies between Iran and Oman and has been one of the world's most important energy routes for decades. A large portion of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas passes through this narrow corridor. This means that if traffic stops there, the shock will not stay there. It will spread to shipping prices, fuel bills, inflation, factory costs, airfare, supermarket shelves, and political pressure in capitals thousands of kilometers away. That is why Iran never had to believe it could beat the United States in a classic head-to-head battle. It was enough for Washington to believe that the cost of conflict could be made so painful that other countries would beg for calm before Washington achieved its goals. And the Strait of Hormuz has always been at the heart of this logic. If you can threaten the vessel, you can terrify the whole body. For years, this has been the deepest fear behind every crisis in the Gulf. Not just the fear that missiles might fly or ships might burn, but the fear that one day Iran might try to turn the world's most important maritime route into a pressure chamber. Mines in the water, speedboats swiftly moving between larger ships, anti-ship missiles hidden along the coast, drones overhead, panicking insurance markets, retreating commercial ship owners, energy traders raising prices before the first wreck sinks. In this kind of struggle, perception can be almost as damaging as physical destruction. And that is what makes the phrase, U.S. Navy shattered Iran's Hormuz blockade, so explosive. Because if that is really what happened, its meaning goes far, beyond a tactical victory. It means the one tool Iran spent decades refining as a form of strategic leverage may have been broken in public view. It means the fear factor attached to the strait may have been punctured. It means a weapon built on risk, delay, and intimidation may have run into a military answer that was faster, broader, and more disciplined than Tehran expected. But to understand why that matters, we have to be very clear about what a blockade in Hormuz actually is. Most people imagine something simple, a line of ships, a visible closure. Real life is more complex. A modern blockade in that waterway is layered. The first layer is danger. The second layer is uncertainty. The third layer is cost. If all three hit at once, traffic can collapse even before every threat is eliminated. Think about it from the perspective of a shipping company. You do not need proof that every mile of the route is mined. You only need a credible chance that one mine is waiting in the wrong place. You do not need to watch every tanker get hit by missiles. You only need to know one successful. Strike could send insurance rates through the roof and expose the company to billions in losses. You do not need to see a Navy physically seal the route. You only need enough fear in the market that captains, insurers, port operators, and customers all decide the route is not worth the gamble. That is how choke points become weapons. Iran understood that long ago. It looked at the balance of power and saw a basic truth. The United States could bring more carriers, more aircraft, more surveillance, more precision firepower, and more allies. So Tehran focused on asymmetric pain, cheap platforms, hidden launchers, swarming boats, mobile mines, coastal missiles, small units that could force bigger powers into slow, expensive operations. The strategy was never just to sink ships. The strategy was to make everybody think twice, then think a third time, then stay away. That is why the real contest in Hormuz is not only about destruction, it is about confidence. Whose confidence breaks first? Can Iran convince the world that transit is too dangerous? Or can the United States convince the world that transit is safe enough under protection? That question sounds technical, but it is actually the heart of the whole drama. Because once confidence shifts, the entire strategic picture shifts with it. If commercial traffic freezes, Iran gains leverage without winning a decisive naval battle. If commercial traffic resumes under American escort, Iran loses leverage, even if it still has weapons left. A choke point only works as a political weapon if people believe you control the consequences of using it. That is the part many people miss. The blockade is not just a line in the water, it is an argument. It says we can make the costs unbearable and nobody can stop us fast enough. To shatter that argument, you do not merely destroy hardware. You have to defeat the idea behind the hardware. You have to show the world that the root can function anyway. If you are gaining real insight from this breakdown, do not keep it to yourself. Share this video with one person who needs to understand what is really unfolding in the Persian Gulf. The only way serious analysis reaches the people who need it is through viewers, like you who share it. One tap makes all the difference. And while you're at it, drop a like to help more people find this content. So how would the United States break something like that? Not with one dramatic strike and not with one perfect speech. It would have to dismantle the blockade the same way the blockade was built, layer by layer. The first layer would be intelligence, before warships escort tankers, before jets hit missile sites, before mine-clearing teams even begin their methodical work. Someone has to know where the danger is forming. That means tracking small craft, coastal movements, radar activity, drone launches, logistics nodes, and command links. In a place like Hormuz, where geography compresses everything, early awareness matters more than ever. If you wait until the threat is sitting on top of the shipping lane, you are already behind. The second layer would be suppression. If missiles, drones, and boat swarms can freely gather near convoy routes, no commercial operator will trust the corridor. So any serious U.S. response would need to push those threats back from the waterway, not just react after they attack. That means striking launch sites, radar systems, fuel depots, command posts, and the small naval infrastructure that lets harassment operations keep coming. It is less cinematic than a single naval clash, but it matters more. You are not just sinking boats. You are collapsing the system that keeps replacing them. Then comes the hardest layer of all, mines. Mines are nasty because they do not care how powerful you are. A billion-dollar warship and a commercial tanker can both be threatened by a device that costs a tiny fraction of either vessel. Mines slow everything down. They force you to search, verify, recheck, and move carefully. They weaponize caution. Even the rumor of fresh mines can rattle markets. That means any force trying to reopen Hormuz has to do two things at once: stop new mines from being laid and clear or bypass the ones already feared to be in the water. That takes patience. It takes helicopters, drones, sonar systems, explosive disposal teams, escorts, and constant overwatch. It is not glamorous work. It is repetitive, dangerous, exhausting work. But it is also the kind of work that decides whether global shipping moves again or remains frozen in place. And that is where a lot of people misunderstand military power. Power is not just about how hard you can hit. Power is about whether you can create enough order after the hitting is done. Anyone can imagine missiles flying. The harder question is this: can you make the insurance market believe the route is usable tomorrow morning? Can you make captains believe the escort is real? Can you make energy traders believe the flow will continue for weeks rather than hours? That is a very different standard of success. If the United States truly shattered the blockade, then somewhere in the middle of all the military action, something quiet but huge must have happened. Commercial actors must have changed their mind. Ship owners must have judged that moving under escort was safer than waiting outside the strait. Insurers must have decided the risks were manageable enough to price, not impossible enough to avoid. That is when the tide turns. Not only when targets explode, but when business returns. And once business returns, the pressure begins moving in the other direction. Because Iran's leverage depends on interruption. The longer the stoppage lasts, the more political pain builds in oil importing countries. Leaders face rising prices. Consumers get angry. Markets wobble. Diplomats start looking for ways to reduce tension quickly. But if the corridor starts moving again under protection, Iran no longer looks like the power dictating terms. It starts looking like the side that tried to close the lane and failed to keep it closed. That is a brutal image problem for a regime that spent years cultivating the opposite reputation. Remember, the value of a choke point threat is partly psychological. It is not enough to own missiles. You must also own the narrative that your opponent cannot restore normal life without paying your price. The moment convoys begin transiting again, that narrative weakens. The moment ship after ship passes through, it weakens further. The moment world energy markets start calming down, the message becomes impossible to hide. The blockade may have frightened the world, but it did not hold. And that is why the most important metric would not simply be how many Iranian boats were hit or how many missile sites were struck. The most important metric would be how many commercial ships actually got through. Because every successful transit is a message. Every tanker that emerges safely is a direct answer to the threat. Every cargo delivered says the same thing in a language markets understand better than speeches. The route is functioning again. Once that happens, the conflict stops being only about the battlefield and becomes a test of endurance, adaptation, and credibility. Could Iran still strike again? Of course. Could it still harass ships, lay additional mines, launch drones, or try to create another insurance shock? Absolutely. But there's a world of difference between being able to create danger and being able to sustain effective closure. One is disruption, the other is control. If the United States broke the blockade, then the central result is not that all danger vanished. It is that Iran lost the ability to turn danger into reliable strategic control. You have made it this far, which tells me you actually care about understanding the full picture. That is exactly why we create these breakdowns. Hit that like button right now to support this kind of detailed analysis, and subscribe so you never miss an update. Every week, we break down a new critical development. Be part of this community. That distinction matters because modern warfare is full of systems that can cause damage without delivering durable political success. You can launch missiles and still fail the course. You can destroy targets and still fail to change the bigger outcome. The real question is always whether force changes behavior at scale. In Hormuz, the relevant behavior is simple. Do ships move or do they stop? And that leads to the deeper reason this story matters far beyond Iran: militaries. Planners in other countries watch choke points very closely. They study narrow seas, crowded straits, contested island chains, and the pressure points of global trade. Why? Because these places offer a tempting shortcut. Instead of trying to overpower a large rival everywhere, you threaten one vital route and let economic pain do some of the work for you. It is a strategy built on concentration. Hit the narrow point, and the shock ripples outward. If Hormuz was used that way and then forcibly reopened, every military analyst studying coercion at sea would take notice. Suddenly, the question becomes larger than one region. How much leverage does a choke point really provide against a state that is willing to escalate, protect shipping, and absorb the costs of sustained operations? How much of the old fear was based on genuine control, and how much was based on the assumption that no one would aggressively contest the closure for long enough? That is the strategic earthquake hidden inside the headline. Because for decades, many people treated a Hormuz closure almost like a doomsday switch. Not literally unstoppable, but so dangerous and so economically disruptive that nobody wanted to test the full answer. That gave Iran an aura of leverage. Even the possibility of closure shaped diplomatic behavior. Even the threat moved markets. But once a threat is tested in the real world, it becomes data, not mythology. And hard data can be very unforgiving. If convoys got through, if exports resumed, if energy prices eased, and if Tehran paid a military and economic price without securing lasting closure, then years of deterrence theory suddenly look less solid than they once did. Not irrelevant, not harmless, but less absolute. The strait would remain dangerous, yet the legend of automatic paralysis would be badly damaged. That damage would carry political consequences inside Iran as well. Authoritarian systems often project strength by making their signature tools appear unbeatable. If one of those tools fails under global attention, the effect is not only external, it can also create internal pressure, blame, and distrust. Did commanders overpromise? Did planners misread Washington? Did the strategy work on paper but fail under modern surveillance and precision strike conditions? Those questions do not disappear because state media wants them to disappear. And there is another uncomfortable issue here, one that any honest analysis has to confront. Reopening a waterway is not the same thing as restoring peace. A corridor can function and still remain militarized. Commercial traffic can return while escorts, aircraft, drones, and surveillance systems stay on constant alert. The world may celebrate that ships are moving again, but the deeper reality can still be tense, expensive, and fragile. That matters, because some people hear the word shattered and imagine total finality. But strategy is rarely that neat. Iran may lose the ability to impose a clean blockade and still retain the ability to create recurring instability. It may lose control of the shipping lane while keeping enough tools to force permanent caution. It may fail at decisive closure and still succeed at making normal operations more costly than before. So, the true measure of victory would not be a perfect return to the past. It would be something more practical. Can the route stay open often enough, safely enough, and consistently enough that the world no longer treats Iran as the gatekeeper of that corridor? If the answer is yes, that is a huge strategic defeat for Tehran. And it would not happen only because of bombs and bullets. It would happen because the United States and its partners managed to do something harder. They would have taken a narrow, frightened, heavily watched waterway and turned it from a symbol of paralysis into a symbol of managed movement. That is not as dramatic as a movie scene, but in strategic terms, it is more important. Think about the signal that sends to oil markets. A closed Hormuz drives fear into prices because traders start imagining shortage, delay, and cascading disruption across multiple economies. An open but protected Hormuz tells traders something else. It says there is still risk, but flow exists, and markets can live with risk much better than they can live with uncertainty about whether the artery itself has stopped pumping. Think about the signal to allies as well. Countries that depend on Gulf energy do not just want statements of support. They want proof that sea lanes can be protected when it matters. Every successful escorted transit would be a reassurance not only to ship owners, but to governments, watching their own economic stability hanging in the balance. In that sense, reopening the strait would be more than a military act. It would be a demonstration of reliability, and reliability is a form of power people often underestimate. A rival can build fear once, a system can only build trust through repetition. One safe convoy helps, 10 help more. Hundreds change the conversation entirely. At that point, what looked like a crisis of access becomes a crisis of credibility for the side that tried to deny access in the first place. There's also the economic angle on Iran itself. A blockade sounds like a weapon against the outside world, but prolonged confrontation cuts both ways. The same regional instability that raises oil prices can trigger countermeasures, tighter enforcement, more aggressive maritime surveillance, and pressure on smuggling networks. In other words, the state trying to weaponize the global economy can discover the global economy has ways of weaponizing pressure back. That feedback loop is easy to miss when headlines focus only on missiles and maps. Yet, it may be one of the reasons a blockade can become self-defeating. If you use the strait to create leverage, but your opponent turns that crisis into a justification for broader military and economic action against you, the cost of maintaining the strategy can rise fast. Suddenly, the choke point is not just hurting others. It is exposing your own vulnerabilities under the brightest possible spotlight. And that brings us to the most important military lesson in all of this. The United States would not need to make Hormuz permanently safe to prove a decisive point. It would only need to show that it can keep commerce moving despite Iranian attempts to stop it. That is enough to break the coercive model. If your threat cannot produce dependable paralysis, then its strategic value drops sharply. You can still menace. You can still harass, but you can no longer claim the world must bow to your control of the corridor. Here is another way to say it. A blockade is powerful when it feels inevitable. It becomes weaker the moment it looks contestable, and it starts collapsing when contesting it becomes routine. That is why imagery matters, not just explosions. Convoys, escorts, merchant ships passing through the narrow water, radar screens staying active, crews doing their jobs, oil still moving. Those scenes may look less dramatic than the opening days of a crisis, but they are the scenes that decide the political meaning of the conflict. Because in the end, a choke point strategy is judged not by the threats it announces, but by the traffic it stops. If it no longer stops the traffic, the strategy is cracked. Now let us go one level deeper, because the biggest change here may not be physical at all. It may be conceptual. For a long time, the world talked about the Strait of Hormuz as though it were naturally Iran's trump card. Geography seemed to guarantee that. Iran sits on one side. Its missile forces, naval units, and surveillance networks are nearby. Its leaders have repeatedly signaled that if pressure rises high enough, the strait can become a battlefield. All of that created a powerful assumption. In a serious crisis, Iran may not win the war, but it can still make the world pay an unbearable price. That assumption shaped how people thought even when no blockade was active. It hovered in the background of diplomacy. It shadowed every sanctions debate. It lurked behind oil forecasts and naval deployments. In that sense, the weapon was partly real and partly reputational. The idea of closure carried value before closure even happened. So if the United States really shattered that blockade, it did more than reopen shipping. It attacked the assumption itself. It told every observer that geography alone does not equal control. Proximity does not equal dominance. And a threat repeated for 40 years is still just a threat until it survives contact with a determined counter-strategy. That is why the word shattered carries such weight here. Not because it promises perfect safety, but because it suggests something larger was broken. The belief that Iran could reliably convert Hormuz from a shared trade artery into a one-sided coercive instrument whenever it chose. And once that belief is damaged, every future crisis starts from a different place. Iran may still threaten closure. Markets may still react. Navies may still surge to the region. But the next time the warning is issued, planners, traders, insurers, and allied governments will remember something important. They will remember whether a previous blockade actually held. They will remember whether ships were ultimately forced to wait outside the strait or whether protected traffic resumed. They will remember whether the world was trapped or whether the threat was broken through. That memory matters because deterrence is cumulative. It is built from what people think happened last time. And if last time ends with escorted commerce moving on schedule, then the future threat does not disappear. But it loses some of its dark magic. This is also where emotion enters the story in a different way. It is easy to talk about straits, tankers, and strategy in abstract language. But behind every line on a map are human nerves. Sailors standing night watch. Merchant crews wondering whether they are sailing into a mine zone. Families back home watching prices rise and fearing a bigger war. Young service members operating in one of the most dangerous waterways on Earth knowing that one mistake could change everything. That is why a reopened corridor is not just an economic fact. It is a statement about discipline under pressure. Somebody had to scan the water. Somebody had to maintain the radar picture. Somebody had to escort slow and vulnerable commercial ships through a space where even a small attack could create panic. Somebody had to carry the mental load of keeping the lane open day after day after day. And that steady work is often what history remembers last, even though it matters most. Spectacular openings grab attention. Sustained success writes the final judgment. If this breakdown has given you a clearer picture than the headlines, finish strong with me. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with one person who keeps asking what is actually going on in the Gulf. Every share helps more people understand these complex events. So when people say the US military shattered Iran's Hormuz blockade, the mature way to hear that claim is not as a chest-pounding slogan. It is as a testable strategic statement. Did the campaign destroy enough of the denial system to make closure unsustainable? Did confidence return to the shipping corridor? Did the economic shock begin to fade? Did the side that tried to coerce the world end up proving the limits of its own coercion? If the answer to those questions is yes, then the title is not just dramatic, it is profound. Because then the story is no longer about one confrontation. It becomes a warning to every state that dreams of using a narrow waterway as a global hostage lever. It says that closing a choke point may start a crisis, but that does not mean you can control how the crisis ends. It says that creating fear is easier than sustaining strategic success. And it says that once a superior naval and air power commits to reopening a route, the burden shifts to the blocker. That is a much harder burden than many people assume. There is still one more truth we need to face, and it is the most uncomfortable of all. Even if the blockade was shattered, the danger that produced it has not vanished from the region. The Gulf will remain a place of missiles, drones, proxy pressure, military signaling, and unresolved rivalry. The map will still be narrow. The stakes will still be huge. The temptation to use geography as leverage will still exist. So this is not a fairy tale ending where one victory dissolves decades of conflict. What it may be, though, is an inflection point. An inflection point is not the end of tension. It is the moment when the old assumption stops feeling automatic. Before, many people assumed Hormuz could be closed in a way that would force the world to bend. After, they may have to consider a harder reality. Closure can be challenged, reopened, and strategically reversed. That does not make the strait unimportant. It makes it even more important because now it is not just a symbol of vulnerability. It is also a symbol of contested resilience, and that might be the most powerful part of this whole story. Not that the water became safe. Not that the conflict became simple, not that one side erased the other, but that a place once treated as the ultimate pressure point may have revealed the limits of pressure itself. So the next time someone says the Strait of Hormuz gives Iran a guaranteed trump card, remember what that claim really depends on. It depends on ships staying away. It depends on markets believing closure will hold. It depends on the world accepting the fear. But if ships keep moving, if markets calm, if escorts work, then the trump card stops looking like destiny. It starts looking like a gamble that can fail. And when a gamble like that fails under the eyes of the world, the consequences echo far beyond one narrow corridor. They echo in every future crisis, every war game, and every oil market forecast, where maritime coercion is tested. In the end, that is why this story feels so much bigger than ships and missiles. It is really a story about leverage and belief. Iran spent years cultivating the idea that Hormuz was the pressure point no outsider could fully neutralize. Theory only rules until reality pushes back. And reality, when it pushes back through operational discipline, can expose the difference between a frightening threat and an effective one. A frightening threat moves headlines. An effective one changes outcomes. A frightening threat spikes prices. An effective one keeps the artery shut. If the blockade was shattered, then Iran managed the first part and failed at the second. And that is why the ending matters so much, because the final image is not a missile launch. It is movement. Merchant ships passing through a corridor once thought to be closed. Proof time and again that the route still works. This is how grand claims actually die. Not with a single explosion, but with a pattern. One passage, then another, until the blockade is no longer a reality. A failed attempt. The shock is not just military, it is psychological. The system adapts. The audience sees the movement, and the impact of fear diminishes in real time. This is a lesson in how economic warfare and public trust clash. Control is defined by what actually passes through the water. The most important maritime pressure point in the world has been tested. The blocker has learned that keeping this closed against a determined force is a heavier burden than imagined. The old rules no longer apply. The assumptions have been shattered. And nothing in the Persian Gulf will ever be quite the same. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the blockade is truly broken, or will Iran find new ways to threaten the strait? And if you want to be here when we find out, make sure you're subscribed because this story is far from finished. The next update might be the one that finally tells us whether the old rules of the Gulf have changed forever.